Hi, and welcome to this video. My name is 𝗟𝗚𝗡𝗧, and I want to share with you how you can use Ableton Live as a hardware sequencer. Because in my opinion, it's incredibly powerful because you can not only send MIDI notes to your device, you can also use LFOs for modulating all possible parameters and also create some more expressive modulations or reaction that allow you to create super unique setups if you're up for doing the work. Because I know that for some people it might be a deal breaker using a computer for sequencing. Maybe you also want to have this kind of standalone DAW-less setup, which I totally understand. But if you're open for that, I think it opens up so many possibilities, and I hope this video can help you get some idea about that. First of all, it's important to have the right connection, and normally this works via MIDI. And here I have my 𝗟𝗚𝗡𝗏. I also have some other instruments, but I wanted to use the 𝗟𝗚𝗏 because here it's particularly amazing what you can do, because it doesn't include any LFOs, or it only has like one knob for changing the parameters, so you can't change two controls at the same time. And this is stuff you can do with the computer in Ableton Live. And it doesn't have USB MIDI, so you see there's a MIDI input, and this is connected to my audio interface where it's connected to the MIDI out. So the interface sends MIDI out to the 𝗟𝗏𝗏 through the MIDI input. And this could also work through some MIDI to USB adapters, so that means you also have this MIDI side, but on the other hand you have like USB, so you connect it directly to the computer. And also more modern devices have USB MIDI, so there's some USB output and you can connect it directly to your computer. And all of this works in exactly the same way, it just transmits a MIDI signal. Once you're in Ableton, you should quickly check the MIDI settings, which you find under Live Settings or Preferences if you're still on Ableton Live 11, and link Tempo MIDI. And now it's important to check the output ports, because in my case it's the audio fuse, because this is my audio interface that sends MIDI to the 𝗟𝗏𝗏, and track needs to be enabled, which is usually by default the case, but in case it's not enabled, just enable track. And for you it could be another name. So if you're sequencing something through USB, for example, I have the Syntect and I can sequence it with a USB cable. It would say something like Syntect MIDI. And also, if you have the MIDI to USB adapter, this device usually also has a particular name. So whatever it is, look for it and make sure that track is enabled. Then you need a MIDI track and some instrument called external instrument that you can load to the MIDI track. And you select MIDI to, again, your device. In my case, it's the audio fuse. And then you need to check the channel. So normally on your synthesizer, you can select the MIDI channel somewhere inside the settings. You can also check the menu for that. And here you can select that channel. So if you're on the wrong channel, your synthesizer still won't receive any signal. In my case, I can use 1 to 6 because the 𝗟𝗏𝗏 is basically 6 synthesizers, which is really powerful. So I could also have different MIDI tracks sending independent sequences to the 𝗟𝗏𝗏, which we can check in a second. But it's important to choose the audio. So in my case, it's input 3 and 4. And now once I compose random notes, I get a signal from my 𝗟𝗏𝗏𝗏. Now, instead of using external instruments, you can also simply send MIDI from the MIDI track to, again, the device. So if I remove the instrument, I can go to MIDI 2, select audio fuse, and again, channel 1. The only thing I need to do now is to create some audio track that receives the signal. Maybe that's helpful if you don't have the Ableton suite. I don't know if the external instrument is part of standard, but maybe you have a version where you don't have the external instrument. You can also simply create a MIDI track that sends MIDI to the device, and then you record it through some audio channel. So now if I select, again, input 3, 4, and I create some MIDI notes here, it will be sent to the audio track. And if you want to record something this way, you need 2 channels anyway. So even if you have like some external instrument, you can't record sound to a MIDI track. So let me quickly set this up again. In this case, if I want to record a sequence, I would need to create some audio track and send the audio from the external instrument channel to this track. So actually here we don't need input then. Again, if I compose something, we should hear it now. And yeah, so that's like the basic setup you need to understand. And let's now check what we can do with a MIDI clip. And actually, Ableton Live 12 is particularly amazing here because you have those generative tools, which can be really fun. Not all of them, but some. For example, the seed. I like it a lot for quickly creating melodies because you can just select a scale. For example, like Lydian, have like a dynamic velocity, maybe just one voice. And you see already we create some MIDI notes. And we can do this a couple of times until we like it and we already get some quite cool sequences. And this actually sounds quite cool. I'm really surprised how well the seed tool can work for creating sequences from scratch really quickly. It's really fun tool to explore. And we can do some additional stuff here. For example, adding some deviation for having some variety in the velocity, because also the patch I have on the Nord drum is velocity sensitive. So this can make the sequence sound a little more dynamic and just less static. And there's also a cool tool for chance, which means the likelihood of a note to appear. And if I decrease the chance, what happened? We will have some gaps and the sequence will sound a bit fragmented, which can be a cool effect for creating some tension. Of course, this is now really random. What I like to do normally is that I select a couple of notes that are important, for example, this note, and I set the individual probability to 100%, maybe also those last two notes. And so those other notes are like making a little dance around the main notes. That's a way I like to think about that. And you have different clip slots, which means you can store variations. So let's actually bring this back to 100% chance for all notes. We can give this the name all or full. Then we can create a duplicate, for example, and lower the chance. It's a very simple example, but there are those cool controllers, for example, like a launch pad, that can help you to change between those different clips. So you can create different variations and change between them, which is amazing for creating some arrangement, because maybe you want to start sparse with just a couple of notes and you want to slowly increase the density, and you can just create a couple of clips that have different types of musical information for creating different types of effects, which I find to be super amazing. So this one you could call, for example, 50%. It's a very technical name, but it describes basically what's happening here. And you can have some more fun with those generative tools. So you can manually make changes to the sequence, but it's also fun to explore, for example, the transformative tools like the recombine, arranging your melody just in a different way, which could also be some variation that you could store. So maybe you duplicate, don't want to override, duplicate it. And for the next clip, you have some other variation. And you can also make structures, because Ableton has a function called follow actions, which maybe goes a little too far to explain how it exactly works here, but it basically means that for this one lane, like the external instrument, you could say that it randomly chooses a clip every 4 bars. And you can find the follow action menu. If you double click on a clip, then it's the icon here, which means follow action. And if you, for example, select any, I think you have to do it for both, maybe also just for the first one. Once you start a clip, it will then, after 1 bar, because the length is, I guess, 1 time means 1 bar, or 1 clip, I don't know exactly, but just as a quick example, if I start it now, you see, then randomly jumps to this one, for example. And if you do it for all clips, it would constantly create some random order, which is pretty amazing for generative music, for example. Now, Ableton also has some super cool MIDI effects for making your sequences more interesting, which you can use in many different ways. So for example, if you go to MIDI effects and let's check random, this one I like a lot. So this adds random notes, and I mean, if you use it standalone, you can get quite crazy results because it will just choose all 12 possible pitches. Which can sometimes sound really nice. But you can also choose a scale, because remember we are in Lydian, so you sync this to a scale and then you just build in some tone variety. Really nice. And you can also be more precise about where you want this to happen. So if you go to the clip and you go to envelopes and you go to random, you can, for example, set some chance per note. And if you press B, you can draw. Actually, let's bring this down to 0. But then you want maybe those notes to be randomized, and also maybe those notes. So then you have some notes that will always stay the same and some that will be randomized. Super cool. And again, you can create lots of different variations and store all of them as individual MIDI clips. And just a little side note, I made a full album sequenced with Ableton Live because I have this amazing synth, the 𝗟𝗚𝗡𝗡𝗚 Performer. I didn't choose it for this video because it can't receive the CC data. That's why I used the 𝗟𝗓𝗡, but still it sounds so beautiful and you can do amazing things with it. And I made a whole playlist about sequencing the Performer with Ableton Live, where I show you basically how I made 5 different tracks. And you are warmly invited to listen to the whole album, also to check out the playlist. I think it gives you some additional information on what you can do sequencing-wise with Ableton and some hardware instrument. And yeah, links are down below in the description. Now, the real fun part comes in once you start modulating CC parameters. And I think this is also new in Ableton Live 12, which is like the CC control. I don't think it was available in Ableton 11. For the 𝗟𝗡𝗡𝗡, actually, there's some amazing program from friend Toby, Ableton drummer. I'm going to link it to you. I also made some videos about it that you can also use with Ableton 11, where you can control all parameters from Ableton Live. But here you also have this sweet device. And now you need to check the manual, which is for all electronic instruments, something that I can highly encourage you to do sometimes, because it's really likely that you learn something new about your instrument or about some new possibility. And all those manuals have some MIDI lists because you need the MIDI numbers for using this. So here I'm at the 𝗟𝗡𝗡𝗡 3P manual, and here's the MIDI list. And you see, okay, there's tone frequency, which is like the filter cutoff frequency on CC 52. So let's go back to Ableton and select CC 52 for this knob here. And now once we move this, we should be able to actually change the cutoff frequency for this one pad. And I mean, okay, this you could still do on the device itself, but you can also now consider using LFOs. So it really gets funny. So we add some LFO. Maybe just a simple slow sine wave that modulates the cutoff frequency a little. So we map it to this knob. And now we get some ongoing modulation, which is something you can absolutely not do at all on the 𝗟𝗡𝗡𝗡 itself, unless you use your playing technique for doing it. And I mean, this is not the most amazing sounding example, but it's more about how it works and seeing what you can do. Because you can use multiple LFOs, you can use multiple CC controls. You don't have limitations, which can also be an issue, because I think that's a great point of buying a hardware sequencer, or I have it with my Syntec, which can also be used as a sequencer. You have a limited choice of LFOs and modulations, and this makes you think wisely of what you want to do, and your whole patch or your whole sound still becomes or still stays kind of simple. While here, once you add tons of LFOs, it can be incredibly complex, and you also might reach that point where you're like, okay, do I really need this modulation? So I think it's just easy to lose track of what's really important doing this. And maybe if you keep in mind that it's fine to use a few modulations, it helps a lot for not getting too carried away inside the DAW. Another kind of similar effect to the LFO is the expression control, which I like a lot because it has basically random LFOs, I call them. I mean, it's not called LFO, but if you select as a source random, and let's actually map it to, let's actually check another modulation like the decay. So let's see, tone decay is 50. So let's choose 50 here. So now we're sending a random value for the decay to the Nord drum with every trigger, because the LFO doesn't really react to the triggers, which is sometimes not what I want, because it's super cool to just have an ongoing variation per trigger on a sequence. So if I map this to this knob, we will now, with every trigger, get some random decay value. You can also refine the range here. Would also work. You can also create some other random curve. For example, for the cutoff frequency, a little less intense. And since you're in a DAW, you can still automate everything. So you can have like a MIDI clip where all of this is happening. Then for another one, you can create some automation saying, okay, the CC control is off, or it's at some other value, or the expression control is off or less intense. I mean, that's quite some work, and sometimes I'm also a bit too lazy to do all of this because I want to focus on the music. But if you're really about digging deep into possibilities, creating lots of variations, and doing lots of tweaking on the computer, I think Ableton Live has way more options for you if you're sequencing hardware than any other hardware sequencer. And maybe one more thing, you can also create your own. You can again call them LFOs, but you can also call them MIDI dummy clips. So let's remove those for now. You can create a MIDI track and create a clip. Again, envelopes, and then you need the same numbers for the MIDI than we were just using. So let's say we want to use 50 for the decay. That's actually what you had to do in the Ableton Live 11. I mean, per clip, because also inside the clip itself, you can use MIDI controls. And for example, now if I draw a curve here for the decay, it would apply this curve to the decay. So let's make something obvious, like short, long, short, long. Actually, we need one more long. I think this note has a super low velocity, which is why it's still so short. But this is something you can also do, so you can be super specific about your curves. Again, storing different clips with different informations, intensities, however. And if you do it via some other MIDI clip, you can also, for example, create a clip that is only 3 quarter notes long. So you create some 3/4. I mean, it's maybe a bit nerdy, but let's do this maybe for the filter frequency because it's more obvious. So you just make a movement from completely open to completely closed, but it's 3 quarter notes, so it overlaps over the duration of this MIDI clip, which is 1 bar. And the only thing you need to do is that you send this to the first track, because now it sends MIDI to this track. It also needs to be armed, so it receives this MIDI, and now we should get this 3/4 filter frequency modulation. Wow, this sounds so nerdy. Oh, and we have to play the clip. And yeah, I mean, those examples are really technical because usually it also needs some tweaking, and I feel like especially if you use complex things like this, you really need to justify using them, so the music needs to sound awesome. Otherwise, it's just like a little toy, which can be fun, but I think there's always a good reason for keeping things as simple as possible. But I mean, if you have any types of ideas of those things that you want to do, you can totally do it inside Ableton Live. And I think with hardware sequencers, it will most likely be a little more difficult. And yeah, maybe as a little verdict, I think if you're a tweaker and you really like to create tons of variations to be really specific about certain modulations and you're really going into the details, you want to plan things, Ableton Live is amazing as a sequencer. But if you're more like a spontaneous person that likes to keep things simple and also on the go wants to create little modulations with like a hardware sequencer, I think it also makes sense to get like a hardware sequencer, because I realized with the Syntect that it just makes me more productive or also more aware in the situation of the musical possibilities, because it's some really good limitation. And in 98% of the cases, I feel like limitations make your music rather better than worse. And yeah, overall, I hope you liked this video and it helped you a little further. And if it's the case, I'd be super happy if you can quickly hit the like button. And also be warmly invited to subscribe, since I have many videos about also generative music, which touches a little on the topic of this video in Ableton Live, or also sound design and also electronic drumming. And I'm going to link you some videos. So this is about generative music techniques in Ableton Live. And here is one about creating hybrid patches, which also includes lots of those things like combining Ableton Live with hardware instruments in a very practical way. And apart from that, I wish you lots of inspiration with whatever it is that you create, and hope to see you soon again at this channel. Bye.